in forming a trilateral working group to support the ceasefire. That said, we are still seeing dangerous hostilities and skirmishes on the margins of Syria, and violence could resume at any moment. Absent more tangible and binding measures, including to build confidence, the ceasefire risks remaining fragile, an interim truce rather than the foundation for lasting stability. Israel's airstrikes have subsided following the latest ceasefire, but IDF ground operations in southwest Syria have continued. Such actions are unacceptable. We must insist on full respect for Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, underscored by adherence to the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. I welcome a ministerial level meeting between Syria and Israel in Paris this week. There is clear scope to address the issues diplomatically and without further confrontation. Mr. President, tragically, the humanitarian cost of recent violence has only escalated. Over 185,000 people have been displaced across Sweda, Dara, and the rural Damascus and beyond. Many are living in precarious conditions with extensive damage to infrastructure compounding their plight. Commercial and humanitarian access challenges to enter Sweda remain very challenging and often disrupted, with periodic road closures and insecurity at contact points. Emergency Coordinator Fletcher will brief you more in detail on this and UN efforts to scale up emergency efforts. And, Mr. President, I am concerned that the month of relative military calm belies a worsening political climate with escalatory and zero-sum rhetoric hardening among many. Part of this has been fueled by the emergence of further distressing footage of graphic abuses that took place inside Sweda during the escalation. At the same time, the formation of a committee to oversee governance inside Sweda and some individual appeals for support from external parties has fueled accusations of separatist intentions. We are closely monitoring the situation in Sweda and remaining in contact with the parties and communities concerned and encouraging steps towards de-escalation and access. Mr. President, we note the interim authorities' response to Sweda, including a statement of condemnation after footage emerged showing the execution of an unarmed man in the medical uniform in Sweda National Hospital. The interim Ministry of Justice also announced the formation of a fact-finding committee tasked with investigating the abuses committed in Sweda. It is essential that the committee's findings are made fully public and that all perpetrators, regardless of affiliation, are held responsible. These events underscore the urgent need for the interim authority security forces to demonstrate that they are acting solely to protect all Syrians and do not constitute a threat. Moreover, leaders on all sides must take a responsibility to counter divisive narratives and promote a shared vision that reflects the rights and security of all communities in Syria. The recent report of the UN Commission on Inquiry documents ongoing violations in coastal and western central Syria throughout the first months of 2025. The interim authorities have publicly acknowledged this report. Its conclusions underline the urgent need for transitional justice measures. Progress cannot be delayed. The separate report submitted last month to President Shara by the Syrian Committee for Investigating and Fact-Finding must be published. Justice for victims and accountability for all perpetrators regardless of affiliation, are binding obligations under standards and under the Constitutional Declaration. Mr. President, if future violence and violations are to be avoided, a serious program on security sector reform and on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration is clearly needed, as also called for in the UN Commission of Inquiry report. Mr. President, let me join you and the Security Council in underlining the importance of countering all forms of terrorism in Syria and expressing grave concern over the acute threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters at large in Syria. The Syrian authorities have made commitments and taken actions to counter ISIL and Al-Qaeda, and it is vital that they take the decisive measures to address the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters. Mr. President, as the Council reaffirmed, an inclusive Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process based on the key principles listed in Resolution 2254 is essential. One that safeguards the rights of all, protects all, meets the legitimate aspirations of all, and enables the Syrian people to determine their own future peacefully, independently, and democratically. In this regard, I note yesterday's publication of the decree that establishes a framework for holding indirect elections for 2/3 of the members of the Interim People's Assembly. My office continues to engage with the Supreme Committee for Elections on their work, and we now await confirmation of the electoral timeframe and the distribution of seats across governorates. I reiterate my previous recommendations. Success in this process demands measures that ensure transparency and openness, and where all major Syrian groups, not just trusted individuals, are included as electors and candidates with the equal and visible participation of women. We recognize that this is a major challenge in areas where disputes remain with the central authorities, but anything less would entrench skepticism, aggravate the forces pulling Syria apart, and impede reconciliation. Moreover, Mr. President, Syria needs to feel that this transition is not a series of ad hoc arrangements and isolated institutions, but a clear and comprehensive path based on inclusion and transparency to implement the principles of Resolution 2254, culminating in a new constitution drafted through popular consensus and resulting in free and fair elections. I hope that the interim authorities can respond to the gravity of the challenge with a clear vision for a path forward, taking bold moves and course recorrections where necessary. As part of this, I urge comprehensive and institutionalized engagement with all communities and leaders, including those critical of the interim authorities, in the spirit of real compromise. Equally, I remind the leadership of other Syrian constituencies and communities of their responsibility to show that they want to be part of united Syria and are willing to engage in action and not just in word, in a peaceful transition that restores Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, let me here say a word on the Northeast, where efforts continue to implement the 10th March agreement. Attempts to convene the two sides outside of Syria continued, but were not successful so far. We have also seen concerning spikes of violence between interim security forces and the SDF during August in Aleppo governorate. We do welcome reported further contacts between interim authority officials and SDF representatives. I hope that such contacts can be cemented into real compromise, and we are continuing to engage both sides on the importance of this and the need for urgent substantive progress on the agreed goal of implementing the 10th March agreement before the end of the year. Mr. President, my office continues to hold regular consultations through the Civil Society Support Room with a broad range of Syrian civil society organizations active in strengthening community dialogue, social cohesion, and service delivery in all parts of Syria. I encourage the interim authorities to create an enabling environment for civil society initiatives and dialogue, which are essential for promoting inclusion, transparency, and legitimacy in the transitional process. Mr. President, my office also hears from Syrian women who continue to stress the necessity of women's meaningful political participation. But we also learn from these women the fears associated with their political participation and engagement, including concerns stemming from threats to personal security and social pressure to refrain from political engagement. Mr. President, as we look toward the voluntary, safe and dignified return of refugees and IDPs to their homes, let me stress the need for sustained and coordinated support for Syria's reconstruction and the rehabilitation of its infrastructure. The damage to physical assets, social systems and livelihoods remains profound. Syria needs tangible international support of an epic scale. Recent decisions to lift certain sanctions represent a significant step in this regard. But these measures must be sustained and broadened, accompanied by substantial funding to reinforce their impact for recovery and reconstruction. And Mr. President, it remains the case that the best way to secure such support is through a genuine political transition that lays the path for long-term stability and sustainable governance. Indeed, without credible reforms, stronger institutions, and a firm commitment to the rule of law, international support risks being squandered or misdirected. To conclude, Mr. President, despite worrying security incidents, the situation has been relatively calmer this month, and I applaud the efforts of all involved in quelling military hostilities. But the country remains deeply fragile, and the transition remains on a knife edge. Across the range of issues in the political transition, including the People's Assembly, the constitutional issues, security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, transitional justice, and the peaceful integration of all parts of Syria and the restoration of Syria's sovereignty and unity, the United Nations is working to support a credible, inclusive and transparent process, working with the Syrian authorities and all Syrians. The path to a sovereign, peaceful and inclusive Syria will demand the courage to compromise, the discipline to follow the rule of law, and the wisdom to remember, as interim President Shara himself said this week, that unity is built not through force and bloodshed, but through understanding and dialogue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al señor Peters.
I thank Mr. Peterson for the information. I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Special Envoy Pedersen has conveyed the precarity of the moment, and I want to reinforce that message and add 4 points. First, as the situation in Asweda reminds us, the humanitarian crisis is not over. Across Syria, 16 million Syrians still need humanitarian support. While, as you heard, the ceasefire in Asweda has largely held, sporadic clashes continue. Alarming reports of abuses during the earlier fighting continue to emerge. More than 185,000 people have been displaced across Asweda, Dara, rural Damascus, and beyond. This week, our teams have visited Asweda city, Salkad towns, and the western countryside of the governorate. They delivered aid and assessed needs. The overall situation is, I'm afraid, dire. We need to sustain urgent delivery of food, health, shelter, clean water, fuel, restoration of water and electricity infrastructure, education. In some areas, those arriving now outnumber the existing population. Services are overwhelmed. We're in close contact with the Syrian authorities and coordinating with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, who have delivered 12 convoys of essential aid, and NGO partners. We have provided emergency food packages, flour, essential household items to tens of thousands of people, including displaced families. Medical kits are reaching key hospitals in Asweda and Dara, while medical teams are providing health and nutrition services. And UNICEF is working with partners to provide bottled water, water trucking, and fuel for water pumping. The Syrian Arab Red Crescent has also facilitated a commercial convoy with key supplies and worked with the Syrian civil defense to transport vulnerable people, including those who wish to return to Asweda. But insecurity and road closures have disrupted commercial supply. Road access is still limited to 2 routes in, through Basra al-Sham and Bursa al-Kharir in Dara. Other routes, including the main highway from Damascus, remain closed. So, we need better humanitarian and commercial access, and most of all, we need safety. Aid convoys have come under fire this month. There have been attacks on health facilities, medics, ambulances. We continue working closely with the Syrian authorities and partners to strengthen channels for help. And I insist again, as I know that you will, on the protection and freedom of movement of civilians, humanitarian workers, and medical missions. Mr. President, my second point. Despite funding and security challenges, the UN and partners are delivering as much life-saving support as we can with the resources we have. In Syria, as elsewhere, as we implement the humanitarian reset, we are now implementing a hyper-prioritized plan, and we've restructured and streamlined our humanitarian coordination effort in country, including reducing senior roles. We are reaching almost 3.5 million people on average every month across Syria, from Latakia to Aleppo to Hasakeh. That is a noticeable increase from last year, despite less funding. Since December last year, we've scaled up across the humanitarian response. Nutrition for children under 5 who are stunted, subsidized bread to 2 million people every day. We're working with the authorities to rebuild critical services. The Ministry of Health with WHO and UNICEF are delivering a new national immunization strategy and rehabilitating hospitals and health facilities. Partners are rebuilding water stations, wells, laboratories, sewer networks. They continue to provide essential services in Al-Hol camp and to support families leaving the camp. And UNHCR has been in discussions on assuming camp management activities. OCHA's country-based pool funds are now providing $75 million to support vulnerable people across the country. We've made some progress on NGO registration and visas for aid workers, but more is needed. I have agreed with the interim authorities the extension of cross-border operations from Turkey as we move towards importing more humanitarian supplies commercially. The Lebanese and Jordanian crossings are open and functioning well, with work towards 24-hour access. But, and this is of course my third point, without more funding, we won't be able to sustain these vital efforts, let alone expand them to more people who need them. The humanitarian appeal for 2025 is only 14% funded. Aid cuts are projected to lead to staffing cuts of at least 40%, across the humanitarian community in Syria, with NGOs hit hardest. 16% of health facilities have suspended or reduced capacity due to the cuts. So, I want to thank all donors who have generously supported the humanitarian response, led at the moment by the EU, Germany, and Canada. And I want to call on all donors to keep supporting Syria and to disperse the generous pledges made at the Brussels conference back in March. Funding cuts are affecting our operations everywhere, of course, but among our 10 largest country appeals, it is the Syria appeal that's the lowest figure. And this is despite these hyper-prioritized plans having reduced the overall ask by nearly $1 billion compared to last year. With more resources, or even the funding that has been repeatedly promised, we can get critical medicine to 1 million more people each month. We can restore water services for an additional 5 million people. We can expand services for people returning to their home areas. We have also worked with partners and in consultation with the interim government to develop a plan to respond to the severe drought-like conditions that Syria is facing. As part of our broader appeal for critical support for food, agriculture, clean water, and health services to 4.3 million people who are most affected. This is, I'm afraid, the worst drought in over 3 decades and an ominous indicator of needs to come. Alongside funding, we also welcome the easing of sanctions by the US, EU, and UK, which opens up potential for vital investment and could reduce humanitarian needs. But the impact of that will take time. Complex legal environment that still continues for humanitarians continues to impede our work. Humanitarian carve-outs help, so I hope that we can extend those exemptions. Finally, Mr. President, while we surge humanitarian support, we need investment in longer-term support for development and reconstruction that will allow the people of Syria to reduce and ultimately end reliance on humanitarian aid. So I also strongly welcome the diplomatic progress made by Jordan, Turkey, the United States, France, countries from the region, and the Syrian authorities. This is a firm foundation for a much-needed shift from a humanitarian-led approach to a stronger development trajectory. The Syrian people do not want to depend on humanitarian help. So announcements of new investments in infrastructure and energy supply are encouraging, not just in their own right, but also as a signal of confidence from the region and beyond. The international community must help translate this momentum into tangible improvements in people's lives by delivering on those planned projects, by taking additional concrete steps on sanction relief and investing in infrastructure. Such initiatives and investments are essential as more than 2 million Syrian refugees and internally displaced people have returned home since December last year. Let me amplify again the call from my colleague Filippo Grandi, High Commissioner for Refugees, following his mission to Syria 2 months ago, where he asked for more support for those coming back. As he said, returns will prove short-lived without increased international support. Mr. President, the international community and this Council has been clear that we must shift the momentum away from the years of hardship and destruction towards recovery and hope. That means sustained commitment, patient diplomacy, and a relentless focus on delivery and implementation. The people of Syria do not need us to be commentators and problem observers. They need us to move with genuine urgency, generosity, and purpose. The humanitarian community has shown that we can deliver. With funding and access, we aim to no longer be needed. Please back us. So, my asks, political action to hold the peace in Asweda and prevent future escalations of this kind. Support for our funding and access requests, and to help us create the conditions, including through investment and sanctions lift, where the humanitarian mission can transition to genuine, Syrian-led recovery and rebuilding. We need to do that for the Syrian people, yes, but not just for Syria. This is a chance to demonstrate that international solidarity still matters and that coordinated international action still works. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al señor Fletcher
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Fletcher, for your briefings. And I welcome the representative of the Syrian government who is with us today. Last week, the United States joined the members of this council in strongly condemning violence perpetrated against civilians in the Ceuta governorate since July, and calling on all parties to adhere to the ceasefire arrangement. We are also concerned by the more recent violence in Ceuta and are closely watching recent clashes in Manjib and Deir ez-Zor, and urge all parties to maintain calm. We recall this Council's clear statement from March, calling on all parties to immediately cease all violence and emphasizing the need for the Syrian authorities to hold perpetrators of mass killings accountable. In that regard, we note the disturbing findings of the UN Syria Commission of Inquiry's latest report on violence against civilians since January, and we express our appreciation for the work of the commissioners. We welcome the Syrian government's actions to conduct comprehensive investigations and hold accountable all perpetrators of the recent violence, as well as its steps to increase the flow of aid, restore public services, and return displaced persons to their homes. We also welcome the Syrian government's pledge to fully cooperate with the UN to investigate crimes and to coordinate with the relevant UN agencies to support the flow of vital humanitarian aid. A united, representative Syria requires a consistent, transparent, and credible justice system. It is now on the Syrian government to take steps to arrest, detain, and pursue measures against those individuals who committed crimes and who are actively contributing to Syria's instability. Colleagues, the United States' support for Syria's sovereignty and territorial unity is unwavering. It is not our role to dictate the shape of Syria's government or constitution, but following the recent tragedies on the coast and in the south, two things should be clear. First, there is absolutely no place for sectarian violence. The Syrian government must act decisively and consistently to protect everyone, no matter their ethnicity or religion. There must be zero tolerance and swift justice for any member of Syria's military that abuses the trust placed in them. Second, every Syrian deserves to have a voice in how their country is governed. The Syrian people fought for more than 13 years, not just to rid themselves of Bashar al-Assad, but also for the right to decide their own fate. The only way Syria will stabilize is if all Syrians have a stake in the country's future and if they collectively share power. That is why we are urging the Syrian government and leaders across the country to engage in meaningful dialogue about their shared future. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're grateful to Special Envoy on Syria, Geir Pedersen, and USG on Humanitarian Affairs, Thomas Fletcher, for detailed reports on the situation in Syria. We have been following the situation very carefully in friendly Syria, and we truly feel for the Syrian people who have had to undergo so many trials. Our relationship is not based on any political context, but is based on tried and tested traditions of friendship and mutual respect, which was confirmed on the 31st of July with the visit of the Foreign Minister and Minister of Expatriates of Syria to Moscow. Unfortunately, the situation in Syria is far from stable. The country continues to confront challenges in almost every sphere, from the difficulties in establishing a new system of government to a very complex socio-economic situation and a humanitarian crisis. We are convinced that the most urgent task in overcoming them is unification of the Syrian society and national reconciliation. Based on that, without exaggerating, the future of Syrian statehood will depend. That the statehood remains fragile, especially in the face of ethno-confessional challenges. This has been clearly demonstrated in the recent tragic events in Sueda. In addition to the March massacre of Alawites and the western coast of Syria, this incident raises serious concerns, both in terms of the scale of the violence and the number of victims. There are serious issues on the methods of use of force implemented on the ground in reacting to such situations. There are very alarming signals from ethno-confessional minorities in Syria that they continue to not feel secure, and they are fear persecution. They are confronting threats of violence and are forced to leave their regions where they reside en masse. For example, in Sueda, 200,000 people were forced to leave. If this situation does not change, it will become a significant constraint on the path towards national reconciliation and reestablishment of the social compact in Syria, and overall could undermine efforts to that end. Colleagues, all cases of violence based on ethno-confessional grounds require a thorough and impartial investigation, holding perpetrators accountable. We look forward to the publication of the full report of the results of the Commission of Inquiry established to investigate the many cases of violence in the western coastal regions of Syria, and we hope to discuss them in the Council. We expect that the interim authorities in Syria will also react to the presidential statement of the Council from the 10th of August, calling for a reliable, immediate, transparent, impartial, and comprehensive investigation of the events in Sueda. This is important to strengthen the authority of the Damascus authorities and trust by the population of Syria. Impartial justice against any criminals and perpetrators, independently of their position and status, should help restore faith of the various ethnic and religious minorities that the new authorities are protecting the interests and security of all Syrians and not specific groups. Unfortunately, the level of terrorist threat remains high in Syria. The terrorist attack on the 22nd of June at the Prophet Elias Antiochian Orthodox Church in the east of Damascus, leading to over 20 fatalities and dozens of wounded, deserves the strongest condemnation. We call the Syrian authorities to step up efforts to combat the terrorist threat and ensure the necessary protection of Orthodox and overall all Christian shrines, and to bring all those responsible to justice. Mr. President, another very important task in the area of state building facing Damascus is the creation of sustainable state institutions. We note measures undertaken by the interim authorities, including the formation of a new government. However, the experience of the past few months has demonstrated also an acute need to conduct structural reforms of the Syrian army and law enforcement bodies in order to ensure that only professionals that are not stained by killing peaceful citizens and having no links to terrorist groups are included. It's important not to abandon career military people who had served the country loyally until December of 2024. Marginalizing them will only further the divide in Syrian society, will create the grounds for revanchism. Using the example of Iraq, we all know that the backbone of the strike forces of ISIS were the officers of Saddam's army who were seeking revenge against those who rejected them. The inclusiveness of the political process to which all members of the Security Council call for must take into account this aspect. There should be no deprivation of rights of any groups of the population, including those who served the state in Syria in the previous phase. The political process led and conducted by the Syrians, this is a basic principle enshrined in Resolution 2254, and it remains as relevant as ever. We expect that measures undertaken by the interim authorities will follow precisely that approach. And the parliamentary elections planned for September will be inclusive, and all ethnic and confessional groups and social groups will take an opportunity to take part in electing the new legislature. Very important in this context remains the reintegration of Kurds into the single Syrian state and the implementation of the agreements between the central authorities and the Euphrates region. Finally, stabilization in Syria and achieving internal tasks will depend to a large extent on external security. Today, the security continues to be undermined by the occupation by Israel of the Golan Heights, as well as the airstrikes by Israel against Syrian territory. We call on all states to strictly adhere to the provisions of Security Council Resolution 2254 about the respect for sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria, and all sides to adhere to the disengagement of forces on the Golan Heights Agreement of 1964. The Security Council confirmed the principles of this in the aforementioned presidential statement and called on all states to refrain from internal affairs and the affairs of Syria. We hope that this appeal will be heeded. Now, moving on to the humanitarian situation. Unfortunately, as Tom Fletcher confirmed today, it continues to be complicated by instability and cascading economic and social problems. We call on the UN and its specialized agencies to continue to work actively to provide support to the population that has suffered from ethno and confessional violence in certain regions of Syria, and to restore infrastructure and ensure conditions for the peaceful return of citizens. We expect that the interim Syrian authorities will contribute to an unhindered work of humanitarian agencies and ensure the security of humanitarian workers. We're very, very concerned about the information provided by Tom Fletcher about attacks against humanitarian workers in the country. This is completely unacceptable. We support the initiative of the International Red Cross to deploy its presence in Sueda. This should contribute to stabilizing the situation and avoiding a repetition of violence. We hope that the Syrian authorities will provide support to the ICRC in achieving this goal. Lifting unilateral sanctions, which for many years prevented the development of the country, no doubt opens a window of opportunity. This is a movement in the right direction. You cannot refute the fact that unilateral sanctions for a long time prevented Syria from moving forward, and at the same time only harmed, in fact, the Syrian people rather than specific political leaders. However, to achieve sustainable results, comprehensive measures are necessary, geared towards the long term. As we see it, such measures should be accompanied not only by efforts of Syria itself, but sufficient international support. It's important to discuss comprehensive and long-term support aimed at restoring key areas of viable statehood. Syria requires not only assistance, but a format of cooperation that could lay the groundwork for future development of the country and allow it to ensure a decent livelihood for all its citizens. According to OCHA data, there's still there's a growing tendency of return of refugees and IDPs to their place of residence. This is a positive signal. At the same time, we believe it's very important that this process be conducted strictly on the basis of voluntary and informed choice by those who decide to return, while strictly complying with guarantees of security for them. Furthermore, we expect that the Syrian authorities, in cooperation with the specialized agencies of the UN, will continue to make efforts to do away with obstacles for those returning, including lack of basic services and lack of employment on the ground. This certainly complicates opportunities for people to start a new life. Mr. President, in conclusion, I'd like to underscore that Russia is a tried and tested friend of Syria, both at the bilateral and the global level. We are very happy to see similar signals from Syria in this new stage of their development. We're grateful to Syrian colleagues for steps that they're taking to ensure the security of Russian citizens and Russian facilities in Syria. We also value that Syria has not forgotten the role that the Soviet Union played in creating the basis of the Syrian economy, strengthening its military industry, and training its experts. We are ready to continue supporting the Syrian people in this post-conflict rebuilding. For us, it's important that Syria, having overcome the interim period challenges, becomes a strong, sustainable, and independent state where everyone, all Syrians, feel comfortable, independent of their ethno-confessional grounds. This should be the focus of the Syrian authorities and the entire international community. Thank you very much for your attention.
Agradezco a la
I would like to thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
I would also like to thank Special Envoy Peterson and USG Fletcher for their briefings this morning, and I welcome the representative from Syria to this meeting. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 points. First, there can be no meaningful political, humanitarian, or development progress in Syria without security. It is the foundation of all else. Denmark urges the parties to abide by the Sueda ceasefire arrangement. We also call on the SDF and transitional authorities to implement the March Agreement, supported by the US and France. We also note that terrorism continues to pose a serious threat. This was underscored only yesterday by the reported capture of senior Islamic State members during a raid in the northwest. In seeking to maintain the security required across Syria, we urge the transitional authorities to protect all Syrians, regardless of race or religion. All armed actors must comply with the obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Second, while we have seen stabilization in parts of Syria, the humanitarian consequences of 14 years of war remain severe, as also highlighted by our briefers today. Syria today hosts one of the largest humanitarian response operations in the world, of which Denmark is proud to remain a top donor, pledging around $95 million to the Syria crisis response this year. From Aleppo to Idlib, Homs and Al-Hasakah, fragile and deeply degraded towns and cities remain in urgent need of rehabilitation, reconstruction of housing, as well as general humanitarian and protection support. Denmark is especially concerned by the recent violence in Syria and its humanitarian consequences. As we have heard today, while there has been some progress in maintaining humanitarian access into and throughout Syria, there remains a pressing need for the greater protection of and access to the local population. Humanitarian staff and supplies in transit must also be guaranteed safety and unhindered access. Those who fled the violence must be able to safely return home. Local peacebuilding efforts will be crucial in reducing persistent intercommunal tensions and restoring calm. Denmark thanks all Council members for their constructive support over the past weeks in agreeing a presidential statement on this crisis. This statement not only highlighted the humanitarian and protection dimensions of the violence, but also sent an important signal on urgent need for credible and transparent investigations and accountability. We take note of the announcements made by the transitional authorities in this regard and believe it is urgent to take concrete measures to advance accountability, prevent further violence, and rebuild trust among affected communities. Mr. President, this brings me to my final point. It's critical for the Syrian people to have a sense of unity, protection, and the benefits of a political transition that brings a just and lasting peace. The future that Syrians want and deserve is one in which all people without distinction are afforded equal opportunities and where all voices are heard. This is particularly crucial as we look towards the election for the People's Assembly. We urge the transitional authorities to ensure that this is conducted transparently and with support from international elections observers. All Syrian communities must be represented in the new legislative body. The safe, secure, and open participation of all members of Syrian society in these elections will demonstrate whether the transitional authorities are truly committed to a new and inclusive Syria. In conclusion, Mr. President, the transformative change underway in Syria will be defined by the political actions taken in the weeks and months ahead. These actions will shape the prospects for rebuilding and re-engaging with the new Syria. The political, social, and security cohesion Syrians are striving for is built on respect, a just political and reconciliation process, and good faith engagement by all. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen as well as USG Fletcher for the detailed briefings, and I welcome the presence of the representative of Syria to this meeting. Mr. President, I wish to highlight the three following points today. First, Syria's volatile security landscape requires urgent action. The Council's presidential statement of August 10 strongly condemned the horrific violence in Sueda, including mass killings and the displacement of more than 185,000 people. The escalation of local sectarian clashes was followed by disturbing reports of serious violations, including by security forces affiliated to the interim authorities against Druze civilians. We were appalled by the shocking footage of medical staff being forced to kneel by armed men in military uniform inside the hospital in Sueda, with one reportedly executed. Following the fragile ceasefire and the announced withdrawal of security forces, we take note of the interim presidency's condemnation of abuses and its pledge of accountability. We expect this process to be credible, swift, transparent, impartial, and effective. Yet, the overall security situation remains precarious. The terrorist threat persists, with sporadic bombings, including the recent attack on the Mar Elias Orthodox Church in Damascus, and earlier sectarian violence along the Syrian coast. We understand that the Committee for Investigation and Fact-Finding into those events has submitted its report to the Syrian presidency. We expect its contents to be shared with this Council or made public to ensure justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators, irrespective of affiliation and in line with international laws and standards. We are further alarmed by the findings of the UN Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council, whose August 11 report points to violations amounting to potential war crimes committed by both pro-former government fighters and interim government forces. In light of this, we call on the interim authorities to ensure full accountability and justice so that all Syrians, regardless of ethnic, religious, or cultural background, can feel safe and protected. And this brings me to my second point. An inclusive political transition under Security Council Resolution 2254 is essential. The formation of a People's Assembly is a crucial step in Syria's political transition. We welcome the announcement of indirect parliamentary elections in September, provided all Syrians can participate as candidates and voters, including Christians, Alawites, Druze, Bedouin, and importantly, women. The recent sectarian violence has reinforced calls for a more democratic and inclusive Syria. Syria's new constitution must guarantee democracy, inclusivity, justice, and fair representation for all religious and ethnic groups and communities, as the current constitutional declaration remains insufficient. The September elections will be an important test in this regard, so as to enhance internal cohesion and increase international support to the efforts of the transitional government to promote stability and prosperity. Mr. President, as the Greek Foreign Minister repeated yesterday on the occasion of his constructive meeting with his Syrian counterpart in Athens, Greece reaffirms its commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria, urging all states to respect these principles. A Syria where Syrians will feel safe. The March 10 agreement between Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast gives hope despite the challenges for its implementation. We call on all parties to act in a spirit of compromise and on regional actors to refrain from incitement or threats of intervention. Similarly, the integration of all armed groups into the national security and military forces, alongside a sustainable solution to the issue of foreign fighters, is indispensable for establishing stability and preventing radicalization. Extremist and terrorist elements can have no place in Syria's future. Mr. President, my third point. All this transpires against the backdrop of a truly precarious humanitarian situation, only aggravated by the climate crisis. As OCHA and Syrian civil society representatives have noted, 16.5 years and devastating wildfires. As a fellow Mediterranean country also facing the impacts of climate change, Greece expresses full solidarity with the Syrian people. We stress the need to reinforce the international humanitarian response, and Greece has decided to engage with the interim Syrian authorities to assist Syria with expertise and best practices transfer in building its capacities on civil protection and against natural disasters. Equally, Greece is ready to support any efforts for an inclusive and representative political system and to promote stability and integration in the Eastern Mediterranean region. In the same spirit, the European Union swiftly lifted sanctions under a gradual, conditional, and reversible approach to support Syria. This policy will continue to be guided by progress on accountability, inclusivity, and respect for international law, including the international law of the sea. In conclusion, Mr. President, Greece reiterates its support and solidarity with the Syrian people as they strive to turn the page from a dark chapter towards a brighter future. This can only be achieved through a genuinely inclusive political transition with credible accountability and security for all. We will continue to support the UN and the Office of the Special Envoy in their efforts to achieve these goals. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Guyana, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and my own country, Algeria. At the outset, the A3+ extends its sincere appreciation to Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and their Secretary General Tom Fletcher for their briefings. We also appreciate the participation at this debate of His Excellency Qusay al-Dahak, the permanent representative of Syria, and also the participation of representatives of Iran, Qatar, and Turkey. Mr. President, the A3+ remains gravely concerned about the overall situation in Syria, which continues to be marked by fragility and volatility. After more than a decade of conflict, the Syrian people still face violence, insecurity, and humanitarian deprivation on an unbearable scale. We take note with deep concern of the recent report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, which documented grave violations against civilians in the coastal region earlier this year. These horrific findings remind us of the urgency of ensuring justice and accountability. Perpetrators of such crimes must not be allowed to act with impunity. Equally alarming are the recent events in Suwaida, with heavy tolls and more than 192 people displaced. The A3 Plus underscores the urgent need for all parties to adhere to the ceasefire arrangement, to protect civilians, and to guarantee immediate and unhindering humanitarian access to all affected areas in Suwaida and throughout Syria. Failure to do so will only deepen the suffering of the Syrian people, hinder recovery efforts, and fuel further instability in the country. We also warn against the danger of this tragic pattern of violence spreading to other regions in Syria. Renewed conflict risks undoing the limited progress achieved so far and undermining the possibility of building a durable peace. In this regard, we call for the full implementation of the March Agreement with the Syrian Democratic Forces, an agreement which represents an important step toward de-escalation and national reconciliation. Only through dialogue, Syrians can overcome their divergences. In this regard, the upcoming legislative elections represent an important opportunity to advance toward inclusive governance. They must be conducted transparently and fairly to strengthen legitimacy and trust. This legislative election process must allow to the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and youth. President, we must be clear in rejecting external interference that exacerbates instability in Syria. The A3 Plus reiterates its strong condemnation of Israel's repeated military action in Syria. Such actions flagrantly violate Syria's sovereignty. The 1974 disengagement agreement, international law, and the UN Charter, ultimately. They only serve to aggravate tensions and further destabilize the region. The A3 Plus reaffirms its unwavering support for Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity. And we reiterate our full support for the efforts of the UN Special Envoy and for a Syrian-owned, Syrian-led political process as the only sustainable path toward peace. We also stress the critical role of the United Nations in this process. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Syria is further exacerbated by the worst drought in decades, with wheat production collapsing by 40%. The A3 Plus takes note that over 2.3 million Syrians have returned to their area of origin. While encouraging, these returns takes place amid severe gaps, which must be addressed if they are to be sustainable. Today, more than half of the population suffers from food insecurity, and nearly 3 million people are at risk of severe hunger. Yet, the humanitarian response is faltering. Insecurity, logistical barriers, and chronic underfunding severely constrain aid delivery. The 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan, which appeals for $3.2 billion, is only 14% funded. This is an alarming shortfall, and the A3+ calls on all donors to urgently mobilize resources to ensure that life-saving assistance reaches those most in need before the crisis spirals further out of control of many persons, particularly among children. We urge increased support, including funding and capacity building to address mine's threat. Mr. President, to conclude, the A3+ firmly believe that the future of Syria must be built on 3 inseparable pillars: accountability for past crimes, inclusivity in the political process, and respect for sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. I thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de...
I thank the delegation of Algeria. I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for their briefings. This month, Syria witnessed its imminent security threats significantly abated as a result of the ceasefire among the parties. However, the uncertain political landscape continues to cloud its horizon for a successful and inclusive transition. Let me highlight the following 3 points. First, we call on all parties of the March Agreement to prioritize building a unified Syria and implement the terms without delay. Since the agreement was reached between Damascus and SDF in March, little implementation progress has been made. While sporadic military clashes along Deir ez-Zor has raised the concerns of the international community over a potential military escalation. The bilateral talks that resumed earlier this month also resulted in few outcomes, dampening the prospect of the agreement being fully